There is a habit shared by over 1 billion people alive right now. It kills more than 8 million of them every single year. It has no nutritional value, no survival benefit, and yet humans have been doing it for at least 12,500 years, possibly much longer. The question is not just why people smoke today. The question is, why did any human ever start? What happened deep in prehistory that made our ancestors look at a burning plant, breathe in the smoke, and decide to do it again? To answer that, we need to go back, not just to the 1400s when Columbus arrived in the Americas, not just to ancient Rome or ancient China. We need to go back to a time before writing, before cities, before agriculture, to the moment when fire and plants and the human brain first collided, and from there we will trace one of the longest and strangest journeys in human history, from sacred ritual to global empire, from medicine to mass addiction, from a plant in the Americas to a product that reshaped the entire world. This is the full story of why humans smoke, Part 1: Fire, Smoke, and the Prehistoric Brain. To understand why humans started smoking, you first need to understand what fire meant to early humans. Fire was not just a tool, it was the most transformative technology in human history. Anthropologists believe humans began controlling fire somewhere between 1 and 1.5 million years ago. The evidence is incomplete, but what is clear is that once humans had fire, everything changed. Fire kept predators away. It extended the day into the night. It allowed cooking, which made food more digestible and unlocked more energy from the same amount of food. Some researchers, including Harvard primatologist Richard Wrangham, argue that cooking with fire is the single most important reason the human brain grew as large as it did. More calories, more efficiently extracted, meant more energy available for brain growth. But fire did something else, something less obvious. Fire produced smoke, and smoke, it turns out, was everywhere in early human life. Early humans lived in caves, in shelters, in enclosed spaces where fires burned constantly. The smoke from those fires contained hundreds of chemical compounds. Some of them were irritants, some were toxic, and some of them were psychoactive. When certain plants burned near or in those fires, the smoke carried compounds that affected the brain. This was not a deliberate experiment. It was an accident of proximity. But the human brain noticed, and the human brain remembered. Now here is where it gets interesting. The human brain has a system specifically designed to respond to nicotine. Not because nicotine is natural to the human body, but because nicotine mimics a naturally occurring neurotransmitter called acetylcholine. Acetylcholine is involved in muscle activation, memory, attention, and learning. Nicotine binds to the same receptors that acetylcholine uses, the nicotinic acetylcholine receptors, and triggers a cascade of effects, including the release of dopamine in the reward circuits of the brain. Dopamine is the molecule of motivation, of pleasure, of wanting to repeat an experience. So when early humans were accidentally exposed to smoke containing nicotine, their brains responded with a burst of dopamine, increased alertness, a sense of calm, reduced hunger, and a subtle, powerful signal: do this again. This was not a choice. It was neuroscience. The brain was doing exactly what it was designed to do, detecting a pleasurable stimulus and encoding it as something worth repeating. The earliest confirmed evidence of humans intentionally using tobacco plants comes from a site in the Great Salt Desert of Utah in the United States. In 2021, researchers discovered a fire pit dating back approximately 12,500 years containing charred seeds of Nicotiana attenuata wild tobacco. The seeds were not food, they were not accidentally present. Their placement and concentration suggested intentional burning. This pushed the confirmed history of tobacco use back by thousands of years beyond what archaeologists had previously documented. But tobacco was not the only plant being burned and inhaled. Across different regions of the world, early humans discovered different plants with psychoactive properties when burned or consumed: cannabis in Central Asia, opium poppies in the Mediterranean, coca leaves in South America, various hallucinogenic fungi across multiple continents. The pattern was global, the behavior was universal. Humans everywhere, independently, discovered that certain plants could alter the mind, and they did not run from that discovery. They built entire systems of meaning around it, part to smoke and the sacred. In almost every ancient culture that used psychoactive plants, the use was not recreational, it was religious, it was ceremonial, it was medical. Smoke itself held deep symbolic power. In many cultures, smoke was seen as a bridge between the physical world and the spiritual world. It rose upward, it was visible but intangible. It could carry prayers, intentions, and the presence of sacred plants into the heavens. In ancient Mesopotamia, priests burned aromatic herbs and resins in temples as offerings to the gods. The word perfume itself comes from the Latin perfumum, through smoke. In ancient Egypt, campfire, complex mixture of herbs, resins, and wine, was burned in temples and used medicinally. Ancient Greek oracles at Delphi may have inhaled vapors rising from cracks in the earth, vapors that geological research now suggests contained ethylene, a psychoactive compound that could produce trance-like states. The oracle's prophecies, which shaped the course of wars and empires, may have been delivered while under the influence of naturally occurring psychoactive smoke. In ancient India, the sacred text of the Rig Veda, written around 1500 BCE, describes a drink called soma, possibly derived from a psychoactive plant consumed by gods and humans alike in sacred rituals. Cannabis has been found in burial sites across Eurasia dating back over 2,500 years, suggesting it was used in funerary ceremonies, possibly to help the living communicate with the dead. And in the Americas, tobacco held perhaps the most elaborate sacred status of any plant on earth. For the indigenous peoples of North and South America, tobacco was not a casual pleasure. It was a sacred plant of extraordinary power. Different nations used it differently, but the common thread was its ceremonial role. Tobacco was smoked in pipes during diplomatic negotiations between tribes. The shared pipe, often called the peace pipe, though that term oversimplifies its meaning, was a ritual object of immense significance. Smoking together was a covenant, a binding agreement witnessed by the spirit world. Tobacco was offered to the earth before planting. It was burned to send prayers to the sky. It was blown over patients during healing ceremonies. Shamans used it in high concentrations, far higher than the tobacco products of today, to induce trance states, during which they were believed to travel between worlds. The Nicotiana rustica, species used in many of these ceremonies, contains nicotine concentrations up to 9 times higher than commercial tobacco. At those levels, nicotine does not just produce calm and focus, it can produce vivid hallucinations, dissociation, and altered states of consciousness. This was not a mild social habit, this was a powerful psychedelic tool, used deliberately, used carefully, used within a framework of deep spiritual meaning. The tobacco plant was not just a plant, it was a living being with its own power and personality. It demanded respect, and for thousands of years it received it. Part 3: Contact, Commerce, and Catastrophe. On October 12, 1492, Christopher Columbus and his crew made landfall in the Caribbean. 2 days later, members of his crew observed indigenous people carrying dried leaves which they lit at one end and inhaled the smoke from the other. Columbus's crew was confused. They had never seen anything like it. Some tried it, some found it strange. They brought samples back to Europe. No one could have known what that moment would set in motion. Within decades, tobacco had spread across Europe. The mechanism of its spread tells you everything about how humans interact with addictive substances. First came the sailors. They had tried tobacco on voyages and brought the habit home. Then came the merchants, who recognized tobacco as a tradable commodity. Then came the physicians, who initially promoted tobacco as a miracle medicine. And this is a crucial point that is often overlooked. Tobacco was not introduced to Europe as a pleasure drug. It was introduced as a medicine. In the 1560s, a French diplomat named Jean Nicot, after whom nicotine is named, sent tobacco plants to the French court as a cure for migraines. He had heard from Portuguese sources that tobacco could heal wounds and treat headaches. The French Queen Catherine de Medici reportedly used powdered tobacco snuff to treat her own migraines, and she became an enthusiastic promoter. European physicians of the 16th and 17th centuries believed tobacco could cure almost anything: headaches, toothaches, bad breath, intestinal worms, tumours. It was prescribed as a treatment for the plague. During the Great Plague of London in 1665, boys at Eton College were reportedly forced to smoke tobacco every morning as a preventative measure. One schoolboy of the era wrote that it was the only morning in his life he was ever whipped for not smoking. The medical establishment of Europe had fully endorsed tobacco, and this medical endorsement gave tobacco a legitimacy that allowed it to spread without resistance, part for the tobacco economy and the birth of an empire. The story of tobacco is inseparable from the story of colonialism. When English settlers arrived in Virginia in the early 1600s, they were struggling to survive. The Jamestown colony was failing. Disease, starvation, and conflict with indigenous peoples had decimated their numbers. Then a colonist named John Rolfe, the same man who would marry Pocahontas, began experimenting with growing tobacco. He obtained seeds of Nicotiana tabacum from the Caribbean and developed a strain that produced a milder, more palatable leaf than the strong tobacco the Virginia indigenous peoples grew. In 1614, Rolfe shipped the first commercial cargo of Virginia tobacco to England. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Europeans loved it. Within a decade, tobacco had become the economic foundation of the Virginia colony. By 1630, over £1 million of tobacco were being exported from Virginia annually. By 1700, that number had grown to £38 million. Tobacco had saved the colony, but it came at a catastrophic human cost: growing. Tobacco was labor-intensive. It required enormous numbers of workers. The indigenous population had been decimated by European diseases. Indentured servants from England were expensive and limited in number, and so the tobacco economy drove one of the greatest crimes in human history. The transatlantic slave trade between the 17th and 19th centuries, approximately 12 to 15 million Africans were forcibly transported across the Atlantic to work on tobacco, sugar, and cotton plantations. Tobacco alone was the economic engine behind much of the early slave trade in North America, the Virginia. Tobacco plantations were built on enslaved labor. The wealth they generated funded the growth of the American colonies and shaped the economic and political structures that would eventually become the United States. The cigarette you hold in your hand today has a history that stretches back through centuries of human suffering. The plant that began as a sacred ritual object for indigenous peoples became the economic justification for the enslavement of millions. Part 5: Industrialization and the Age of the Cigarette for most of human history. Tobacco was smoked in pipes, cigars, or as snuff. The cigarette, the thin paper tube of tobacco that defines modern smoking, is a surprisingly recent invention. Cigarettes existed in crude form in South America for centuries, where indigenous peoples wrapped tobacco in leaves or corn husks. Spanish and Portuguese colonists adopted the practice, and by the 18th century, crude cigarettes were common in Spain and Portugal. But the cigarette as a mass-produced, globally distributed product was born from the Industrial Revolution in 1881. James Bonsack invented a cigarette rolling machine that could produce 120,000 cigarettes per day, the equivalent of what 40 skilled hand rollers could produce in the same time. James Buchanan Duke, an American tobacco entrepreneur, licensed the Bonsack machine and used it to undercut every competitor in the market. By 1890, Duke had formed the American Tobacco Company, a monopoly that controlled over 90% of American cigarette production. The price of cigarettes collapsed. They became affordable to almost everyone, and Duke spent aggressively on a new tool that was just beginning to reshape commerce: advertising. Cigarette cards were inserted into packs, collectible series featuring athletes, actresses, and military heroes. Children collected them. Adults bought cigarettes to get them. The cigarette had been transformed from an occasional luxury into a mass consumer product, and the timing could not have been more consequential. World War I changed smoking forever. Cigarettes were included in soldiers' rations by multiple armies. Military commanders believed smoking improved morale, reduced stress, and suppressed appetite in the field. Tens of millions of young men were introduced to cigarettes through military service. When the war ended and those men came home, they brought the habit with them. Smoking rates exploded across Europe and North America in the 1920s. And then the tobacco industry did something that would define the next century. They targeted women. In 1929, a public relations consultant named Edward Bernays, the nephew of Sigmund Freud and the man widely credited with inventing modern public relations, was hired by the American Tobacco Company. Women smoking in public was considered unacceptable at the time. Bernays organized a group of women to march in New York's Easter Sunday parade while publicly lighting cigarettes, which he called torches of freedom. He framed smoking as an act of female emancipation. The stunt made front-page news across the country. Within years, women's smoking rates began to climb dramatically. The tobacco industry had not just sold a product, they had attached it to an identity, to freedom, to modernity, to sophistication. By the mid-20th century, smoking was everywhere. In movies, in hospitals, in airplanes, in offices. Doctors appeared in cigarette advertisements. Brands claimed their cigarettes were recommended by physicians. The most famous campaign of the era declared, "More doctors smoke Camels than any other cigarette." Part 6: The Science Fights Back. The first serious scientific warnings about the health effects of smoking began appearing in the 1950s. In 1950, two landmark studies, one by Richard Dahl and Austin Bradford Hill in Britain, and one by Ernst Winder and Everts Graham in America, independently established a statistical link between cigarette smoking and lung cancer. The tobacco industry's response was immediate, coordinated, and deeply cynical. In 1953, the heads of the major American tobacco companies met in New York and hired the public relations firm Hill and Knowlton. The strategy they developed became one of the most studied examples of corporate deception in history. Rather than acknowledge the evidence, they decided to manufacture it out. They created the Tobacco Industry Research Committee, which funded studies designed not to find the truth but to create the appearance of scientific controversy. For decades, the industry publicly claimed that the link between smoking and cancer was unproven. Internal documents released decades later showed they knew the truth. As early as the 1950s, tobacco company scientists had privately concluded that smoking caused cancer and that nicotine was addictive. They suppressed that research. They lied to the public. They lied to Congress. In 1964, the U.S. Surgeon General released a landmark report officially concluding that cigarette smoking causes lung cancer and other diseases. It was a turning point, but the tobacco industry continued fighting for decades more. They lobbied against health warnings, they marketed to teenagers, they developed menthol cigarettes specifically to appeal to black communities, they expanded aggressively into developing countries as Western markets declined. The full reckoning came in 1998, when the major American tobacco companies signed the Tobacco Master Settlement Agreement, paying $206 billion to U.S. states and agreeing to restrict advertising. It was the largest civil settlement in American history. Part 7: Why We Still Smoke Today, Despite Everything. We know over 1.3 billion people worldwide still smoke. Smoking rates have declined dramatically in wealthy countries, but they remain high or are even rising in parts of Africa, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific. Why? The answer lies in the biology of addiction, the power of the tobacco industry, and something deeply human about how we respond to risk. Nicotine addiction is not a moral failure, it is a neurological one. When nicotine enters the brain, it triggers dopamine release within seconds. Over time, the brain adjusts, it downregulates its own dopamine production. It becomes dependent on nicotine to maintain normal dopamine levels. Without nicotine, the brain experiences withdrawal anxiety, irritability, difficulty concentrating. The cigarette does not make the smoker feel good, it makes them feel normal. The pleasure is the relief from the withdrawal the cigarette itself created. This is one of the most efficient addiction loops ever designed by nature or by industry, and the tobacco industry understood this mechanism decades before the public did. They engineered cigarettes to maximize nicotine delivery. They added ammonia to tobacco to convert nicotine to its freebase form, which crosses the blood-brain barrier faster and produces a more intense effect. They were not just selling a product, they were engineering a trap, but biology alone does not explain why people start smoking. Social factors are equally powerful. Smoking is disproportionately common in lower-income communities, in communities with high levels of stress and limited resources, and in communities that have been specifically targeted by tobacco marketing. The tobacco industry spent decades identifying and targeting vulnerable populations, teenagers, low-income communities, racial minorities, people in developing countries. The geography of smoking today maps almost perfectly onto the geography of tobacco industry targeting, and yet for all the damage it has caused, the story of smoking is also a story about something fundamental to human nature, the desire to alter consciousness, to find relief from pain and stress, to participate in rituals that connect us to something larger than ourselves. The indigenous shaman who inhaled concentrated tobacco smoke to enter the spirit world and the office worker who steps outside for a cigarette break are separated by thousands of years and entirely different contexts. But they are both reaching for the same thing. A moment of altered state, a pause in the relentless demands of consciousness, a chemical that tells the brain, for just a few minutes, that everything is manageable. The difference is that the shaman used a powerful plant with intention and within limits. The modern smoker is caught in an addiction loop engineered by an industry that spent a century hiding what it knew. The plant did not change, the context did, and that context, the industrialization, the advertising, the deliberate engineering of addiction, is what turned a sacred ritual into the leading preventable cause of death on Earth. The story of why humans started smoking begins with fire, with an accidental encounter between the human brain and a psychoactive plant, with a nervous system that was never designed to resist the signal that nicotine sends. It runs through tens of thousands of years of ritual and ceremony, through the violence of colonialism and the slave trade, through the genius and cynicism of industrial capitalism, through the most sophisticated deception campaign in corporate history. And it ends here, in the present, with over 1 billion people still smoking, still reaching for the same chemical signal that first fired in a prehistoric brain sitting too close to a burning plant. The habit is ancient, the trap is modern, and understanding both is the first step towards something different.